we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm Ashlyn Burgett, your moderator for today's webinar, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's session on on-site audits for cloud environments. Let's go over a few things before we dive into our discussion. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, and this session is also being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides in your inbox tomorrow. Just a little bit of background about who we are before we get started. KirkpatrickPrice is a licensed CPA firm and PCI QSA, providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 13 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We do offer information security services such as audits and pen testing, as well as readiness and guidance on frameworks such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC for cybersecurity, PCI DSS, HIPAA, high-trust CSF, FISMA, ISO, and GDPR. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars so that you can catch up on any series at any time, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'd also like to remind everyone that this presentation is provided by KirkpatrickPrice for educational and/or informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation, so should you need legal advice, please consult with your attorney. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Mike Wise is a lead practitioner at KirkpatrickPrice with over 15 years of experience in the information security industry. He holds CISSP, QSA, and CISA certifications and tends to focus on data centers and distributed computing. In his current role, he enjoys helping clients grow in their understanding of information security, and he is dedicated to educating, empowering, and inspiring our clients to greater levels of assurance. So, welcome, Mike, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome, everyone. I appreciate you coming to this webinar today. We're going to have a very interesting discussion. So what we're going to be looking at is a couple different things when it comes to cloud environments. We're going to be looking at is there really an accurate picture now of what is in the cloud and what isn't in the cloud? Then we're going to be looking at the shifting of risks, because one of the things you'll see as we go through this webinar is that now that people are moving into the cloud in a rapid manner, the risk has shifted, and it may have shifted in ways that you're not familiar with. And then we'll also be looking at different cloud models, because different cloud models also have the ability to define what risks are going to be posed to a different organization. So let's start off and kind of dive right in with what's in the cloud, with what isn't in the cloud. One of the things that we have seen is that there's kind of been a bad assumption that everything is in the cloud. A really interesting report that I'm pretty sure that most of you have heard of is the McAfee Cloud Adoption Risk Report. This report has gotten a lot of buzz because it has some really interesting metrics that kind of show that that the cloud adoption rate has really increased. So one of the key metrics and kind of one of the really big takeaways is that sharing of sensitive data in the cloud increased 53% year over year. So if you think about that, 53% is a huge margin for increase for that to happen year over year. Another really big number that happened is the average enterprise generates over 3 billion events every month in the cloud. You talk about the word noise, that becomes like very important when you think about 3 billion events. How can a human deal with that? So that becomes a really interesting concept when you think about how many events and alerts and things that everyone has to deal with on a daily basis when you have 3 billion events being generated every month. The average enterprise uses 1,935 different cloud services. So let's pause and think about that for a second. 1,935. When we used to look back in the day when we were just having our local on-site data centers with our little closets and things like that, I mean, that kind of number would be unheard of for most people, because having that many different services going to a cloud service provider somewhere else would be unheard of in older models. But now in this day and age, people are using different APIs, people are using different public cloud service providers, they're using a lot of different things to build their applications and services. So that number, that huge number, is being generated by using those different services. Another big number that came out of this was that 8% of all organizations experience at least one compromised account threat every month. One compromised account threat every month. So if you think about that, that one compromised account could potentially lead to a breach, which could lead to a company being on the news, like we've seen recently in a lot of different arenas. So that is kind of a really big number as well when you have that many accounts that are getting compromised at that rate. Then finally, 5.5% of all AWS3 buckets that are in use are misconfigured and publicly readable. So we'll just stop there for a second. How many different news articles have we read about a public AWS bucket, a leaky AWS bucket with bad permissions, exposing confidential data or exposing client data, as the case may be? We've all read the news articles about that. We've all seen that. So those misconfigurations can be very, very, very bad and cause large breaches. We've seen that a lot of different news articles have come out, a lot of different reports, a lot of different things that come out about how AWS S3 bucket configurations it can be a very dangerous tool, a very dangerous thing that can happen. So this report really kind of encapsulated some really big numbers that have come because of cloud adoption, and also has identified a lot of the risks that have come out of this new adoption that has been rapidly growing for cloud environments. So when we talk about is everything in the cloud, the conclusions we often see are nothing to see here, it's all in the cloud, not a problem. A feeling of false assurance and ignorance is bliss. We don't know how it works. Like one of the things that I hear often is it happens to our cloud provider, but they don't understand how the operation works. If we give them our data, they do something and then it happens, but we don't understand the security controls that the cloud provider has implemented. So not having an understanding of exactly what's going on in the cloud is a very big thing that we've seen for a lot of different organizations that have made this cloud adoption. So that kind of brings us to the flip side of the coin is what kind of questions should we actually be asking when people are using this cloud adoption model? So the first one is really, who is working on the cloud resources? So it becomes very important when those cloud resources are holding sensitive data. So let's say you have credit card data, PII, PHI, anything like that, and you have those stored in a cloud resource. So it becomes very, very important as to who is working on those cloud resources, who has access to the infrastructure, who has access to those resources. That becomes critical. How did the information get in the cloud? So one of the things that we look at when we're doing audits is, where are the transfer points? How are you transferring data into that cloud environment? Are there some SFTP buckets sitting out there that you're using to move information around? Are you connecting to an API? How are you getting that information into the cloud? Are there other locations that impact the cloud? So a really important thing that we see is that you might have a lot of processes that are in the cloud, but you're going to have some manual processes that are done outside the cloud, and they might be transferring that information into the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. Another thing is, are there third parties that can impact the cloud? This becomes very important. As we've seen with a lot of different API services, a lot of different third-party service providers, that as the cloud adoption grows, so do third parties that are impactful to that cloud adoption. So you could have third-party support teams, you could have third-party data sources, things like that. Are there processes that run outside of the cloud? So we were talking about that a little bit before. So you might have a solution where you are ingesting some data manually and then making sure that it gets up into the cloud. But that manual ingestion is happening by human resources, human people. They're actually the ones there doing the scanning, copying, or data entry, as the case may be, of those manual pieces of information and putting those in the cloud. So there might be some processes that run outside the cloud that are going to be very impactful to the data security of your application and service. So let's talk about processes that don't take place in the cloud. So why this is key is because what I'm going to show you is that when you're going through and having an audit done, you can't just look at the cloud resources. When people say, oh, hey, it's only scoped to the AWS environment, or it's only scoped to the Azure environment, or it's only scoped to the Google Compute environment, that's not really true, because you have a lot of processes that are going to happen outside of cloud. So one of the first and probably the biggest one is you can't manage the cloud from the cloud. As much as we might want it to, robots do not manage our cloud as of right now. We have humans doing it. So you are going to have your systems administrators, you're going to have your engineers, you're going to have whatever the case may be. They're not going to be cloud resources. They're going to be human individuals that are going to be managing the cloud from some location. They're going to be on a laptop or workstation, whatever the case may be, and they'll be logging into the cloud management tools that you have to manage those cloud resources and to deal with making sure that your systems are running. The next thing is the development and DevOps activities. So DevOps has become probably one of the biggest things in the past year or two in terms of new paradigms and how operations happen. There's kind of this blending of worlds, and the DevOps methodology with things like continuous integration, continuous deployment has really changed what happens and where it happens and how it happens. So you're seeing a lot of different things and a lot of different new tools being deployed, which is also bringing in a lot of new different risks. HR, onboarding, training, team meetings, stand-ups, the people stuff. All organizations are made up of humans. They're made up of people. They're the ones that are doing the work, things like that. All organizations have some kind of human interaction and have some kind of human resource pool that is used to fulfill the service delivery as your clients require it. So those humans are important because they're kind of the foundation of the organization. So all those things we talked about, the HR, onboarding, training, team meetings, stand-ups, those all need to be taken into account when we're performing these audits. Decision-making. So you have management. Management is not going to sit in the cloud. Those are going to be human individuals. They're going to be the ones that are going to be making those decisions about the operation of the organization. They're going to be dealing with some of those human things that we've been talking about before. They're going to be a very important part of the process to make sure that you're providing information security and the availability that your clients are requiring. And finally, governance, tone from the top. We talk about things like boards, senior management, all those people, all those pieces that are providing that executive oversight. So that becomes critical because that really sets the tone and direction for the organization. So without that piece, the organization really doesn't function. So, and that piece that happens is outside of the cloud environment. So all these things don't take place in the cloud. So the assumption that everything happens in the cloud, it's over there, it's fine, is not actually true, as you can see from just asking these few questions. Now that we've kind of identified that, hey, maybe not everything takes place in the cloud, let's talk about the shifting of risks. How do the risks shift when you go with this cloud adoption model? So, what are some of the risks that are in a cloud-centric environment? Companies are getting too comfortable with risks when they move to the cloud. Like I was saying before, people have the kind of idea that once it's in the cloud, it's not my problem anymore. It's the cloud provider's problem. That is absolutely 100% untrue. The cloud doesn't remove the risk, it just shifts it. And this is a really critical concept because the false idea that, hey, we've just basically gotten rid of all our risk because we moved everything to the cloud is not true. Your risk has just changed and shifted is really what has happened. When you move to the cloud, new risks immediately emerge. As we go through this webinar a little bit more, you're going to see that when you move to the cloud, new things pop up. You have to have new understanding of how things operate and what the interoperability is between different resources. So you're going to have new risks that are going to be presented to your team. You're going to have to understand, does your team understand what those risks are and how to address those risks? And finally, it is easy to make a mistake in the cloud because the technology, the best practices, and expectations are still new. So I'm going to use the Capital One breach that just happened. It was really interesting reading the legal brief that was put out in relation to the Capital One breach, because the first thing that stood out to me was a misconfiguration was really the kind of cause of what happened here. So a very complex environment, assuming for Capital One, was there, and there was a misconfiguration that was probably very innocuous that allowed a bad actor to come in and exfiltrate important data. And that basically led to the saga that Capital One is going through now. So it was that misconfiguration and not understanding, okay, hey, this is how this certain service and utility was going to be configured, and it was configured incorrectly, which led to that. So having these new technologies, understanding the best practices, and understanding the expectations of what's going to happen is still very new, and it's still very complex as well. So as we said before, the risk has shifted and it's changed, and now there's a whole new layer of risk that has been layered on in the cloud environment. So we just talked about that Capital One breach and talking about how configurations and complexities can cause unexpected, unintended consequences. So really it comes down to new complexities emerge, which creates new risk vectors. So one of the things that when I talk with my clients that I talk about all the time is identity and access management. Identity and access management to me is one of the greatest tools and one of the greatest risks that has ever been created in the cloud environment. If you ever look at a policy in AWS IAM, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. When a single star can literally cause your identity and access management to basically go out the window, that becomes a very big deal. So identity and access management has great complexity, it has great power and great ability, but it has great risks as well. So this has really kind of brought into the cloud world a whole new layer of risk that people are very quickly kind of coming to understand that it can really cause you harm very quickly if you don't understand exactly what a policy is going to do or how a policy is going to be evaluated. Because a lot of people won't know that, hey, you can have one policy attached to some resource and then you can have another policy somewhere else, and one policy might trump a policy that you don't expect in a certain way. So those kind of things can cause problems very quickly. The next is data sprawl. With the ability of things like DevOps, with the usage of APIs and the ease of deployment within cloud service providers, data sprawl has become a very big thing. I talk to clients all the time, and they're like, and they will say to me, Mike, I don't really know exactly how many resources that we have everywhere because they change on a day-to-day basis. We spin things up, we spin things down, we kind of operate that way. But that kind of data sprawl and not having a really understanding of the boundaries of your environment or where data lives, or, hey, these developers have access to the account and they're spinning up resources in this account over here, or what's exactly going on, is a very real problem that a lot of clients deal with. Because when you have thousands of resources in a cloud provider and you have multiple accounts that are all over the place, then it can become a really big problem. And like I brought up on the last slide, the risk has shifted. So how has the risk shifted? What are some ways that the risk has shifted? Uptime risk has shifted to design risk. So it used to be that you were worried about your personal 5 nines. You had to have the power going, you had to have the cooling going, you had to have the bandwidth available, all that kind of thing. Now you're really worried about design risk. Are you deploying multiple AZs? Do you have a strategy to get out of an entire region if the region goes down? So those design risks become really important. As we saw a few years ago when the US East had those big problems, a lot of the internet broke. To put it pretty plainly, a lot of the internet broke. I remember very clearly that it was just not working. There was many of the biggest sites in the world were not functioning correctly because of US East and AWS not really working. Environmental and physical failure risks shift to replication and access risks. So what does that really mean? So it used to be, like I was saying before, we had environmental and physical failure. So you were going to have things like the crack unit was going to break, or you would have things like the UPS power was going to have to kick in when your utility power was lost, things like that. Now you're going to start worrying about, hey, are we replicating our databases like we're supposed to? Do we have enough slaves? Do we have elastic groups configured so we can make sure that we can spin up new resources as we get more traffic, things like that. So those environmental and failure risks are shifting to replication and access risk now. But ultimately, responsibility for data security still rests with the organization, and reputational risk cannot be shifted. This is kind of one of those hard rules that is never going to change. As an organization, the organization is still going to always be responsible for that data security, because when the client says, hey, was there a breach? You can't say, hey, it was just over there Amazon. They did it. No. It's still going to have a reputational impact on you. So at the end of the day, the organization is still ultimately responsible for that data security, and the reputational risk is going to be on that organization. Another really big kind of idea that has come out of this cloud-centric environment is assurance through shared responsibility. In the early days of the cloud, in this cloud model, it became, I heard many times, the cloud provider is responsible for everything. And what has happened is the cloud providers have said, no, we are really not responsible for everything. The organization, aka their client, has a lot of responsibility when it comes to how security in the cloud operates. So there's really these two ideas kind of came out of this entire conversation and discussion that was happening. Security of the cloud versus security in the cloud. The provider is responsible for security of the cloud, as the organization is responsible for security in the cloud. So that really comes down to, hey, the provider is going to provide that physical security for cloud resources because you as the organization don't have access to those. So they're going to be responsible for that physical security. But you as an organization are responsible for configuring identity and access management rules. You're responsible for configuring the security groups correctly to make sure that access from the perimeter is controlled. You're responsible for making sure that you architected your environment correctly so that if an availability zone has an issue, your application will be able to survive that. So you're also responsible for making sure that your EC2 instances have patching applied, things like that. So there's really the difference of security of the cloud, which is the responsibility of the cloud provider, versus security in the cloud, which is the responsibility of the organization. And that distinction has become very important in understanding, A, what your responsibilities are, and B, where some of the risks are going to lie. So we've talked about new risks. We've talked about what the industry has seen and how the cloud-centric model has basically exploded as it has grown. So let's now talk about some cloud models that are being deployed. So the first one is a model that is going to be for usually a large organization. I'll see these in, but this is going to be what we call a hybrid model. Some of the resources are in the cloud, some are on the ground. A lot of times we'll see, okay, hey, they'll have their own co-located third-party data center where they'll have their own self-managed VMware environment or OpenStack environment or something like that. But then they'll have resources that are also in AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever the case may be. We'll see a lot of that where they'll have some kind of connection between the two environments, and they'll be moving information between those two environments. Another part of this could be local development environments and clouds in production. So in this case, you'll have your local development environment will be in a cloud somewhere, and then you'll have a production cloud environment, which is where you're going to push your production deployment. Then after that, you're going to have what we call a virtual model. This is where you're going to have no corporate offices at all. Employees work from anywhere and everywhere. So this is what a lot of people characterize as the quote-unquote Starbucks model. So you're going to have your engineers and your developers and all your people. They're going to be working from every location under the sun, and all it requires them to have is a laptop, usually some kind of VPN connection and some kind of two-factor authentication, hopefully. And that'll allow them to work in the environment that they need to. This has really changed how things are thought about in relation to what risks are posed to these people. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in additional slides. And then finally, we have what we call corporate with cloud model. This is where you're going to still have a corporate office, but that corporate office is just going to have an internet connection. So it's basically an office where all the people sit, but there's no resources stored there. Everything's in the cloud. You're doing everything in one of those public cloud providers, but all the people are going to sit in a corporate office. So with each of these different environments, the on-site becomes critical. And I kind of want to break down why the on-site is critical, because this will help you understand, going back to our original idea of, is everything in the cloud? And when we go through this slide, it really will help define why everything is not in the cloud. So let's start off with the hybrid model. So you have some resources and assets that are not yet migrated. This is basically the classic, hey, we have some things in the cloud, some things are not in the cloud. So this really brings in the point that we need to go assess, hey, where is that physical security for those resources that are not in the cloud? How are you getting the information from the stuff that's not in the cloud to the stuff that's in the cloud? So that becomes really important there. And then after that are the people, processes, and technologies. Like I was saying from in the beginning, the people that work on the cloud, the people that are developing for the cloud, all those things are not in the cloud. They are outside the cloud. Those humans are not pieces of data. They're actually human beings. They're the ones executing those processes. They're the ones managing your environments. They're the ones doing all those things. So they're staying outside the cloud. Then we have our virtual environment. So with your virtual environment, you have just allowed risks from everywhere, and you've kind of brought that into the environment, because now you have people working from Starbucks, you have people working on different internet connections that might be unsecure, you have people working from wherever. So the risk is everywhere in those environments, because you have those people all over the place. And those people are still the ones that are managing the cloud. They're the ones executing those processes. They're the ones that are making sure that your environment is operating. They're the ones with the access into the cloud as well. So it becomes very important that we talk to those people and get to and understand how do they understand security, how do they implement best practices, and what are they doing. Then we have the cloud with the corporate. So interesting thing about the cloud with the corporate is about scale. So as these large organizations start to do their shift into these public cloud environments, or private cloud providers as the case may be, it becomes very important to understand that as the organization size scales, so does the risk as well, because now you're going to have multiple offices that are going to be doing things. You're going to have teams that are dispersed all over wherever country, world, as the case may be. So you're going to have a lot of different people interacting with these environments. So the security of those has to be implemented at all those different locations. And these are the ones that are still not in the cloud, and they're executing the processes, and they're the ones that are doing the work that is making sure that your data is secure, that your applications and services are online, and that you're servicing your customers. So in each of these cases, the on-site is critical, because we need to talk to those people, and in some cases we need to see the physical security, the environmental security for those resources that are not in the cloud. So assessing those pieces that are not in the cloud becomes critical, and that's why the on-site is so important. Now let's talk about it from the auditor perspective. I'm an auditor, so I go out to clients all the time. I travel all over the world and in the US, and I talk to people, and I look at, and I'm going to assess their environments and provide that independent auditor opinion. And we as auditors operate under some very strict guidelines, depending on the different audits that we're doing. So it could be we're operating under the PCI Council requirements. It could be that we're operating under the AICPA requirements, whatever the different governing body is. But we have some very, very strict rules that we have to follow. We are putting our name, our reputation, our firm's reputation on the line when we issue opinions. And we have to take that responsibility seriously. This is not something that we would take lightly ever. And it's something that we really work to make sure that we are able to provide that independent opinion. We want to accurately depict your organization. Your clients are reading that SOC 2, SOC 1 report, or they're reading that PCI AOC, because they want to get an understanding of your environment to make sure that the information that they're giving you or the service that they're using is secure. The other really critical thing that we see as auditors is that you as an organization may have processes, procedures written down that may operate, you may think operate one way, but when we talk to said DevOps engineer or systems administrator, they go, that's not exactly how we do it. And when we talk to those people, we actually find out and understand what the control actually is. It might not be exactly what you're thinking, and it might be a risk that you guys are taking that you didn't know about. And kind of to sum this all up, why the on-site is so important is it's giving that reasonable assurance, and it's allowing us to provide that opinion. And if your auditor isn't asking for an on-site, you should be suspicious of their integrity and the audit's quality, because there is no way to issue that opinion that is going to be able to accurately depict the organization and to understand what the controls that you actually have in the environment without having that on-site and talking to those people, observing those processes, and understanding what the environment really looks like. So how can KirkpatrickPrice as an organization help you? And what can we do for you in terms of providing those assessments? We're an information security firm with senior level cloud experts. One of the things that we work really hard at inside of KirkpatrickPrice is to make sure that our auditors are well versed in cloud environments. Not only the public cloud environments, but also the tools that are used with those public cloud environments and the tools that the DevOps engineers are using, things like that. And we as auditors provide personnel with the ability to simultaneously address physical and cloud environments. So we talked about that hybrid model. So you may have a internal corporate data center, and you also have a deployment within Azure or AWS or Google Compute. And we as auditors are going to be able to assess not only the physical controls that you have in place, like you have visitor access logging, you have door controls, you have video surveillance, all that kind of good stuff, but we also can assess your cloud deployments. We can look at your identity and access management policies. We can look at your security group configurations. We can look at your availability configurations and how are you using elastic data stores, things like that. What are you doing to provision your environment in the cloud? So we can look at both sides of the fence. We can look at the traditional on-site resources, and we can look at cloud resources as well. And the final kind of thing is that we have the ability to perform information security services specifically for AWS and Azure. We take a lot of time internally to make sure that we have tools that allow us to assess AWS and Azure environments. And we spend a lot of time internally at KirkpatrickPrice with training with our auditors to make sure they understand not only the cloud environments themselves, but tools that interact with those cloud environments. So when we talk about DevOps, hey, do we understand deployment pipelines? Like, do we understand how Jenkins interacts with things? Do we understand how Packer builds packages? Do we understand what the hooks are that are going into these environments? Because that entire deployment pipeline becomes something that we have to look at from a risk perspective. So we not only look at the cloud environment itself, but we look at tools that interact with those cloud environments and the security of those as well. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, we can have those answered.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, Mike. If you do have questions, you can send them in now using the Q&A feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will be sure to get back to you within 24 hours with a response. Or if you'd like, you can email Mike directly using his email on the screen. Thank you all so much again for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.